In the frozen winter of 1945, deep in the Bavarian countryside, a secret unfolded that could have cost dozens of lives. German women, mothers, daughters, and widows risked everything to commit the ultimate betrayal against the Reich. They hid wounded American soldiers in their cellars, attics, and barns, defying the Gestapo and facing execution if discovered. This is the true story of courage that transcended borders and ideology. Elsa Vogel stood at her farmhouse window, watching smoke rise from the distant village of Oberammergau. The year was 1945, and Germany was collapsing. Her husband, Friedrich, had died 2 years earlier at Stalingrad, leaving her alone with a small farm and memories that haunted her sleep. The war had taken everything from her: her husband, her brother, her faith in the cause she once believed in. Now, at 32 years old, Elsa questioned everything the Reich had promised. The 1,000-year empire was crumbling, and with it the lies that had sustained it. That February morning, as frost covered the Bavarian fields, Elsa heard aircraft engines roaring overhead. American bombers, she recognized the sound. Moments later, explosions echoed across the valley. Black smoke billowed into the gray sky. One of the bombers had been hit. She watched through her kitchen window as the massive aircraft spiraled downward, trailing fire. Parachutes bloomed like white flowers against the dark clouds. At least some of the crew had escaped. But escaped to what? If the SS found them first, they would be shot on sight. Hitler's orders were clear: no mercy for terror flyers. Elsa should have reported what she saw. Every loyal German citizen had that duty. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of her husband's letters from the Eastern Front, where he had written about the senseless slaughter, the frozen corpses, the young men dying for a madman's vision. Perhaps it was the growing realization that this war was lost, and more death would change nothing. Or perhaps it was simply that Elsa Vogel had seen enough suffering and refused to contribute more. She grabbed her coat and headed into the forest where she had seen the parachutes descend. The snow was deep and her breath formed clouds in the freezing air. After 20 minutes of searching, she found him. An American airman lay crumpled against a pine tree, his flight suit torn and bloodied. His left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. He couldn't have been older than 25. When he saw her approaching, terror filled his eyes. He tried to reach for his sidearm, but pain stopped him. Elsa raised her hands slowly, showing she meant no harm. She spoke no English and he spoke no German, but some communications transcend language. She pointed to his leg, then to herself, then back toward her farmhouse. He understood. The airman, whose name she would later learn was Lieutenant James Parker, hesitated. Every propaganda poster had told him Germans were monsters, but this woman, with her kind eyes and gentle gestures, seemed anything but monstrous. He had no choice anyway. Without help, he would freeze to death or be found by the SS. He nodded. Getting Jim back to the farmhouse took over an hour. He leaned heavily on Elsa, gritting his teeth against the agony of his shattered leg. Several times he nearly passed out, but Elsa was stronger than she looked. Years of farm work had built muscle and endurance. When they finally reached her home, she brought him not to the main house, but to the root cellar beneath the barn. It was cold, but hidden. She made a bed of hay and blankets, then examined his injuries. Her nursing training from before the war came flooding back. The leg was badly broken but could be set. He had also taken shrapnel to his shoulder and ribs. He needed a doctor, but bringing one was impossible. She would have to manage with what she had. Over the next 3 days, Elsa cared for Jim in secret. She set his leg as best she could, fashioning a splint from wood and cloth. She cleaned his wounds with precious antiseptic she had saved. She brought him food from her meager ration: soup, bread, preserved vegetables. He was delirious with fever for the first 2 days, calling out names in his sleep. Sarah, Mom, Bobby. Gradually the fever broke. His eyes cleared. He looked at her with wonder and confusion. Why was she doing this? Why would a German risk her life for an enemy? Elsa wished she could explain, but language remained a barrier. Instead, she showed him. She brought down a photograph of her husband in his Wehrmacht uniform. She pointed to Friedrich, then made a gesture across her throat. Dead. Jim understood. She was a widow. The war had taken from her too. In that moment, a connection formed. They were not enemies. They were two people caught in the machinery of war, trying to survive, trying to retain their humanity. But Elsa's act of mercy was about to expand far beyond one American pilot. In the village, 17-year-old Hilda Schneider had heard whispers. Other parachutes had been spotted. Other Americans were hiding in the area. Hilda was young, but the war had aged her quickly. She had watched her father die in a bombing raid. She had seen the Hitler youth leaders send boys her age to their deaths in the final desperate battles. She no longer believed the propaganda. When she learned that Frau Becker, the elderly baker, was part of a network helping hide Allied soldiers, Hilda volunteered immediately. Frau Becker was 58 years old and had lost all three of her sons to the war, one at El Alamein, one in Normandy, one in the Hurtgen forest. The grief had transformed her. She no longer cared about the Reich or the Führer. She cared only about stopping the senseless death. If she could save some mother somewhere from receiving the telegram she had received 3 times, then she would. Her bakery became a center of covert resistance. In loaves of bread she hid messages. In flour deliveries she concealed medicine. Her ovens baked not just food, but hope. The network grew carefully. Frau Becker connected with Elsa through a trusted intermediary. Soon, Elsa's cellar housed not just Jim, but 3 other wounded Americans. Sergeant Thomas Chen, a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, had been shot during a reconnaissance mission. He had a bullet wound in his thigh that was dangerously infected. Private Michael Donovan, a tank crewman, had suffered severe burns when his Sherman was hit by a Panzerfaust, and Corporal Eddie Walsh had taken shrapnel across his back and could barely move. Caring for 4 wounded soldiers was exponentially more difficult than 1. The medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Food was scarce for everyone in Germany by early 1945, and feeding 4 extra men was nearly impossible. But Elsa managed. She traded her last pieces of jewelry for medicine on the black market. She watered down the soup to make it stretch further. She went hungry herself many nights so the wounded men could eat. Hilda helped, smuggling supplies from the village and acting as a lookout. The young girl's energy and optimism brought light to the dark cellar. She even tried to teach the Americans some German words, and they taught her English in return. Laughter, rare and precious, sometimes echoed from beneath the barn. But danger was never far away. The Gestapo was actively searching for the downed airmen. Posters were put up in every village offering rewards for information leading to their capture. Patrols increased. Houses were searched randomly. The penalty for harboring enemy soldiers was death, not just for the person doing the hiding, but often for their entire family. Every knock on the door could be the end. Every unexpected visitor could mean discovery. Elsa's salvation came from an unlikely source. Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, a Wehrmacht captain stationed in the area, had grown deeply disillusioned with the Nazi regime. At 45, he was old enough to remember Germany before Hitler. A different country, a better country. He had fought in Poland, France, and Russia, and he had seen the war crimes, the mass shootings, the burning villages. He knew Germany had become the monster it once feared. When he began to suspect that locals were hiding Americans, he did not report it. Instead, he quietly helped. Klaus would tip off Frau Becker when Gestapo raids were planned. He would misdirect search parties away from certain farms. He used his authority to declare areas already searched when they had not been. It was a dangerous game. If the SS discovered his duplicity, he would be hanged as a traitor. But Klaus had already decided that if Germany was to have any hope of redemption, someone had to choose mercy over obedience. He was not alone. Other Wehrmacht officers, sickened by the atrocities and recognizing the war was lost, quietly sabotaged the hunt for Allied soldiers. In Elsa's cellar, the wounded Americans slowly healed. Jim's leg mended enough that he could walk with a crutch. Tommy's infection cleared after Frau Becker obtained smuggled penicillin through her network. Michael's burns began to heal, though they would scar him for life. Eddie regained movement in his back. They knew they could not stay hidden forever. Eventually, they would need to either surrender to the advancing American forces or attempt to reach Allied lines on their own. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. The Americans struggled to comprehend why these German women were risking everything to save them. Jim, in his improving German, asked Elsa directly one night, "Why?" She was silent for a long time, searching for the right words. Finally, she said, "You are someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband, just as my Friedrich was." This war has taken enough. I will not let it take more if I can prevent it. Jim understood then. It was not about politics or nations. It was about recognizing the human being behind the uniform. Tommy Chen, despite his wound, maintained a remarkable sense of humor that lifted everyone's spirits. He joked that he was getting better food in a German cellar than he ever got in the army. He taught Hilda American slang and made her laugh with exaggerated stories about life in San Francisco. The friendship between the young Chinese-American soldier and the German teenager was unlikely, but genuine. They represented a future where the hatreds of this war might finally fade. One night, a new arrival came to the cellar. It was not another American, but a German. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, a 19-year-old Wehrmacht soldier, had deserted his unit. He had been ordered to execute captured partisans, including women and children, and he had refused. Rather than face a firing squad for disobedience, he fled. When he heard rumors of a network helping hide people from the regime, he sought them out. Frau Becker brought him to Elsa's farm. The irony was not lost on anyone. German and American soldiers, enemies by definition, now hiding together in the same cellar, united by their rejection of the war's brutality. Otto's presence complicated things, but it also helped. He could move more freely than the Americans. He could gather information, acquire supplies, and provide warnings. He became the network's scout. His youth and apparent innocence allowed him to pass through checkpoints without suspicion, but the danger was always escalating. In March of 1945, the Gestapo intensified their efforts. Someone had informed them that Allied soldiers were being hidden in the region. Mass arrests began. Several families were taken away in the night, never to return. Frau Becker's bakery was searched. The Gestapo tore through her shop, looking for evidence. They found nothing. She had been warned by Klaus just hours before and had removed everything incriminating. But the search left her shaken. She was an old woman playing a young person's game, and she was exhausted. Yet she refused to stop. Each life saved was a small victory against the evil that had consumed her country. Hilda was nearly caught one afternoon while carrying medicine to Elsa's farm. A Gestapo officer stopped her on the road and demanded to search her basket. The vials of precious penicillin were hidden beneath eggs and vegetables. If he found them, she would be arrested and tortured for information. The entire network would be exposed. Hilda's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, even smiling at the officer. She flirted, played the innocent village girl. The officer, young and perhaps lonely, was charmed. He glanced casually into her basket, saw the eggs, and waved her on. Hilda walked away slowly, fighting the urge to run. Only when she was out of sight did she allow herself to shake with terror. The close calls were mounting. Everyone in the network knew it was only a matter of time before they were discovered, but still they persisted. It was no longer just about saving the Americans. It was about reclaiming their own souls, about proving to themselves that not all Germans had been corrupted by the Reich. In a nation that had embraced evil, these few individuals chose goodness, and that choice mattered. As March turned to April, the sound of artillery grew closer. The Americans were advancing from the west. The Soviets were closing from the east. Germany was being crushed between two unstoppable forces. In the chaos of the collapsing Reich, the Gestapo's grip weakened slightly. Resources were redirected to the crumbling front lines. Some officers fled knowing they would face justice for their crimes, but others became more desperate and more dangerous. A cornered animal is most vicious, and the dying Nazi regime was no exception. In mid-April, disaster struck. The Gestapo received a specific tip about Elsa's farm. An informant, perhaps motivated by the reward, or perhaps by fanatical loyalty to the Führer, had reported suspicious activity. A squad of SS troops was dispatched to investigate. Klaus learned of the raid, but too late to provide much warning. He managed to get word to Otto, who sprinted to the farm ahead of the SS. There was no time to evacuate the Americans. They were still too wounded to flee through the forests. The only option was to hide them better and hope. Elsa made a desperate decision. She brought all the men, Americans and Otto, into a hidden space beneath the cellar floor. It was barely large enough, a crawl space used for storing root vegetables in the deepest winter. The men squeezed into the darkness, hardly able to breathe, as Elsa replaced the wooden boards and covered them with dirt and straw. Then she went upstairs to wait for the SS. When they arrived, 4 armed men in black uniforms. They were brutal in their search. They overturned furniture, smashed dishes, tore through her belongings. They interrogated Elsa, demanding to know if she was hiding enemies of the Reich. She denied everything, maintaining a calm exterior, even as terror clawed at her insides. The SS men went to the barn, to the cellar. They stomped around just feet above where the hidden men lay in suffocating silence. One soldier even stood directly on the concealed trapdoor. Jim, below, held his breath, certain they would be discovered. But the hiding place held. The camouflage was good enough. After 2 hours of searching, finding nothing concrete, the SS men grew frustrated. Their commander, a hard-faced Obersturmführer, glared at Elsa with suspicion. He did not believe her, but he had no proof. He warned her that they would be watching, and if she was lying, she would hang. Then they left. Elsa waited until she was certain they were gone before opening the hidden space. The men emerged, gasping for air, cramped and terrified, but alive. It had been close. Far too close. After that raid, it was clear they could not stay at the farm. The SS would return with more men and more time. A new plan was needed. Klaus Reinhardt took a tremendous risk. He arranged for the Americans to be transported, disguised as wounded German soldiers being evacuated to a hospital further west, toward the American lines. It required forged documents, stolen uniforms, and an ambulance truck. Frau Becker used her network to acquire what was needed. Hilda sewed German insignia onto scavenged uniforms. Every detail had to be perfect. One mistake would mean death for everyone involved. The journey was planned for April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, a day when there would be ceremonies and distractions. The ambulance, driven by Otto in a stolen Wehrmacht uniform, would carry the disguised Americans through checkpoints. Klaus would provide escort orders that would, hopefully, get them through any inspections. It was audacious and terrifying, but it was the only chance. The morning of the escape, Elsa said goodbye to the men she had sheltered for 2 months. Jim took her hands in his and spoke in halting German. "Thank you. You saved my life. I will never forget." Elsa smiled sadly. "Go home, Lieutenant. Tell people that not all Germans were monsters. Tell them some of us tried to stop the madness." Jim promised he would. Tommy hugged young Hilda, making her promise to survive the coming chaos and to find him in America after the war ended. She promised through tears. The ambulance departed just after dawn. Frau Becker watched from her bakery window, praying silently. Klaus rode in a staff car ahead of the ambulance, using his authority to smooth the way. The first checkpoint went smoothly. The guards barely glanced at the papers before waving them through. The second checkpoint was more thorough. An officious Feldwebel insisted on inspecting the patients. Otto's heart raced as the sergeant climbed into the back of the ambulance. The Americans lay on stretchers, bandages covering their faces, pretending to be unconscious. The Feldwebel looked them over, then shrugged and left. They were through, but at the third checkpoint, their luck ran out. An SS officer was present, conducting spot inspections. He was suspicious and methodical. He examined Klaus's orders closely, then demanded to see identification for every patient. The Americans had forged papers, but would they hold up to scrutiny? The SS officer studied each document, comparing photographs. "These do not look like recent photos," he observed suspiciously. "These men appear to have different facial structures." Otto, thinking quickly, explained that the men had suffered severe facial trauma from shrapnel, which is why they looked different and were heavily bandaged. The SS officer was not convinced. He reached for his radio to call headquarters for verification. At that moment, Klaus made his choice. He drew his pistol and shot the SS officer. Chaos erupted. The checkpoint guards scrambled for weapons. Klaus shot 2 more before they could react. Otto started the ambulance and gunned the engine. They crashed through the barrier, bullets ricocheting off the metal frame. Klaus's staff car followed, providing cover fire. Behind them, the checkpoint erupted in confused shouting and gunfire. They had perhaps 10 minutes before a pursuit would be organized. Klaus knew he was now a wanted man. He could never go back. He had thrown his lot in with the fugitives. The vehicles raced west toward the sound of American artillery. They abandoned the roads, crashing through fields and forests, the ambulance barely holding together. Behind them, German forces mobilized. They could see motorcycle patrols in the distance closing in, but ahead the front line was visible. American tanks on a ridge, stars on their sides. Freedom. Salvation. They were a kilometer away when machine gun fire tore into Klaus's staff car. The vehicle swerved and crashed into a tree. Klaus stumbled out, wounded in the leg. Otto stopped the ambulance and the Americans jumped out, no longer pretending to be wounded Germans. They were in a no-man's land now, with enemy fire from behind and unsure if the Americans ahead would recognize them as friendly. Jim grabbed Klaus, supporting him, and they all ran toward the American lines, waving white cloth and shouting in English. American soldiers on the ridge saw the desperate group running toward them, pursued by German forces. They held fire, uncertain. Then they recognized American uniforms mixed with German ones. Officers radioed for clarification. Jim, using his last strength on his healing leg, screamed at the top of his lungs, "We are Americans! We are Americans! Do not shoot!" Finally, recognition. The American tanks opened fire, not at the fleeing group, but at the pursuing Germans. Shells screamed overhead, exploding behind them. The pursuit halted. The group collapsed into American lines, gasping and exhausted. Medics rushed forward. Officers demanded explanations. Over the next hours, as they received treatment and debriefing, the full story emerged. The Americans were astonished. German civilians and even a Wehrmacht officer had risked everything to save them. It contradicted everything they had been told about the enemy. But here was the proof, living and breathing. Klaus Reinhardt, wounded but alive, was not treated as a prisoner, but as a defector and hero. He provided valuable intelligence about German positions. More importantly, he gave testimony about the network of Germans who had resisted the regime's evil. Otto was granted asylum immediately. The Americans even dispatched intelligence officers back toward the lines to try to locate and protect Elsa, Hilda, and Frau Becker, to ensure they would not face retribution from the SS in the chaotic final days of the war. In the village, Elsa and Hilda heard the artillery growing louder. They knew the Americans were close. They also knew the SS was conducting final purges, executing anyone suspected of disloyalty. Frau Becker's bakery was burned in the night by retreating SS troops. She barely escaped with her life, fleeing to Elsa's farm. The three women hid together, waiting for either liberation or death. The hours crawled by. Gunfire echoed through the valley. Then, finally, silence. On April 23, 1945, American tanks rolled into the village. The Wehrmacht had fled. The SS had vanished. The Reich was finished. Elsa, Hilda, and Frau Becker emerged from hiding, blinking in the sunlight. American soldiers entered the village cautiously, expecting resistance. Instead, they found white flags and exhausted civilians. Among the liberating forces were intelligence officers who had been briefed about the resistance network. They had photographs and names. They searched for Elsa Vogel, Hilda Schneider, and Frau Becker. When they found them, the Americans did not arrest or interrogate them. They thanked them. The officers explained that the men they had saved were safe, that Lieutenant Parker had told their story, and that they were being recognized as heroes. Elsa wept. She had not saved the Americans for recognition or reward. She had done it because it was right. But knowing they had survived, that her risk had meant something, brought overwhelming relief. In the weeks that followed, as Germany surrendered and the full horror of the Holocaust was revealed, Elsa struggled with shame and guilt. She had not known the full extent of the death camps, but she had known enough. She had seen Jewish neighbors disappear. She had heard the whispers. And she, like millions of others, had not done enough to stop it. Saving 4 American soldiers did not absolve Germany of its crimes. She knew that. But perhaps it was a beginning, a small act of redemption in an ocean of guilt. Jim Parker returned home to Pennsylvania. He carried with him the photograph of Elsa and a promise to tell her story. He spoke at schools and community groups about the German woman who had saved his life. He challenged the narrative of collective German guilt, arguing that there had been resistors, quiet heroes who risked everything. He wrote letters to Elsa regularly, even helping her emigrate to the United States in 1949. She settled in a small town in Ohio, working as a nurse, living quietly. She never sought attention or acclaim, but those who knew her story understood they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Hilda Schneider married an American soldier in 1947 and moved to Chicago. She became a teacher, educating young Americans about the dangers of totalitarianism and the importance of individual moral courage. She stayed in touch with Tommy Chen, who had indeed been from San Francisco. They remained friends for life. Tommy would often say that a 17-year-old German girl taught him more about bravery than any soldier he ever met. Frau Becker rebuilt her bakery after the war. She never spoke publicly about what she had done. When asked, she would simply say she had baked bread and tried to help where she could. She died in 1962, surrounded by the community she had served and protected. At her funeral, 3 American veterans traveled to Germany to pay their respects, men whose lives she had helped save. They told stories the villagers had never heard, of the baker, who had been a secret warrior against evil. Klaus Reinhardt remained in Germany after the war. He testified at several trials against Nazi war criminals, providing crucial evidence. He worked to rebuild a democratic Germany, serving in local government. He corresponded with the Americans he had helped escape, and in 1953, he was invited to the United States. Jim Parker met him at the airport. The 2 men, once enemies by uniform, embraced as brothers. Otto Schmidt struggled more than the others. The guilt of having worn the Wehrmacht uniform, even though he had deserted, haunted him. He eventually found peace working with veterans organizations, helping former soldiers from all sides cope with the trauma of war. He never married, dedicating his life to reconciliation and healing. The story of Elsa, Hilda, Frau Becker, Klaus, and Otto is not unique. Throughout Nazi Germany, there were individuals who resisted, who sheltered the hunted, who chose humanity over ideology. Most of their names are lost to history. They did not seek glory. Many were caught and executed, but they existed, and their existence matters. They prove that even in the darkest times, goodness survives. Even when a nation descends into madness, individual conscience can remain intact. The women who betrayed the Reich did so not out of political conviction, but moral necessity. They saw human beings suffering and chose to act. In doing so, they reclaimed their own humanity and offered a model for resistance that transcends any single conflict. Their story reminds us that orders are not destiny, that uniforms do not define morality, and that the courage to do right exists in the most unexpected places. In 1986, Elsa Vogel died peacefully in Ohio at the age of 73. At her funeral, Jim Parker, now an elderly man himself, delivered the eulogy. He spoke of a cold February morning in 1945 when a German woman found a wounded American in the snow and chose mercy over obedience. He spoke of how that choice saved not just his body but his faith in humanity. He wept openly as he described how Elsa's courage had changed his life and the lives of countless others who heard the story. The lesson of these German women is timeless. When systems demand cruelty, individuals can choose kindness. When authority commands hatred, people can offer love. The Reich demanded absolute loyalty, but Elsa, Hilda, and Frau Becker recognized a higher loyalty, to conscience, to compassion, to the fundamental truth that every life has value. They betrayed the Reich to serve humanity, and in doing so, they became the truest patriots Germany could claim. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on these incredible acts of courage, and give this video a like to help others discover these forgotten heroes. History is filled with darkness, but it's also filled with light. Let's remember both.